"You're in the wrong seat. This is VIP." The chief flight attendant snapped, making the entire business class cabin laugh, as they mocked the woman in an old hoodie and jeans for sitting out of place. Passengers whispered, sneered, some even demanded she be kicked off the flight. But just as she stood to leave, the intercom suddenly blared, "Ladies and gentlemen, the owner of this airline, Madame Olivia Carter, is on board this flight." The cabin went dead silent, while those who had mocked her turned pale, unable to lift their heads. Olivia Carter stood in the aisle, her brown hair falling loose over her shoulders, a little tangled from a long day of travel. Her hoodie was faded, the kind you'd find in a thrift store bin, with frayed cuffs and a small tear near the pocket. Her jeans were worn at the knees, and her sneakers had a stubborn scuff across the left toe that no amount of scrubbing could fix. She looked like someone who'd wandered in from a red-eye flight, not someone who belonged in the polished glow of business class. The passengers noticed her right away, their eyes narrowing, their whispers starting before she even sat down. She carried an old backpack, the zipper slightly rusted. And when she set it down, it made a soft thud against the carpeted floor. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, but there was a weight to her movements, like she was used to being watched, judged, and found wanting. She didn't fidget or look away. She just stood there, letting the room size her up. Hey, if the story's grabbing you, take a second to open your phone. Hit that like button, leave a comment about what's hitting home for you, and subscribe to the channel. It keeps us going, sharing stories like Olivia's with folks who get it. All right, let's keep moving. The chief flight attendant, Karen, was a woman in her late 40s, her hair pulled back in a bun, so tight it looked painful. Her uniform was crisp, her badge gleaming, but her smile was all edges, like she was waiting for a reason to snap. She'd clocked Olivia the moment she stepped into the cabin, her eyes flicking over the hoodie and jeans with a mix of disdain and suspicion. "The economy's in the back, sweetheart," Karen said, her voice loud enough to turn heads. She held out her hand for Olivia's boarding pass, her nails painted a glossy red that matched her lipstick. The passengers perked up, sensing drama. A man in a navy blazer, his tie loosened like he was too important to care, leaned forward in his seat. "Bet she bought some cheap ticket off a discount site," he said, his voice carrying a smug edge. His name was Richard, a real estate developer who liked to flash his Rolex when he talked. A woman across the aisle, her blonde hair sprayed into a perfect helmet, chimed in. Her earrings were gold, dangling like tiny chandeliers, and her voice was syrupy with fake pity. "Those clothes," she said, shaking her head. "Honey, this isn't the bus station." Her name was Jessica, a self-proclaimed influencer with a following built on luxury travel vlogs. The cabin erupted in laughter, sharp and cutting, like they'd all been waiting for someone to say it. A guy in a pinstripe suit, Greg, a hedge fund manager with a permanent smirk, joined in. "She looks like she's here to clean the plane, not fly on it," he said, his voice low but loud enough to carry. The laughter grew, a wave of it rolling through the cabin, each chuckle colder than the last. Olivia didn't react. She handed Karen her boarding pass, her fingers steady, her eyes meeting the attendant's without a flicker of doubt. Another passenger, a middle-aged man in a tailored gray suit, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. His name was Edward, a tech CEO who prided himself on spotting imposters in any room. He held a glass of champagne, swirling it like he was in a boardroom instead of a plane. "You'd think they'd check IDs more carefully," he said, his voice loud and deliberate, like he wanted everyone to hear his authority. He glanced at Olivia, his eyes narrowing as if he could see right through her faded hoodie. "Some people will do anything to sneak into places they don't belong." The other passengers nodded, their murmurs growing louder, feeding off his confidence. Olivia's fingers paused on the edge of her seat, her knuckles whitening for just a moment before she relaxed them. She didn't look at Edward, but her silence seemed to pull the air tighter, making his words feel smaller than he'd intended. Karen scanned the boarding pass, her frown deepening, her red nails tapping the edge of her clipboard. "This doesn't look right," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You sure you're in the right cabin?" The question hung in the air, an invitation for more mockery. Olivia's voice was quiet but clear, like a bell cutting through fog. "I'm sure," she said. She sat down in 2A, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was claiming the space. The laughter didn't stop, but it shifted, like they were annoyed she hadn't backed down. Jessica, the blonde, leaned toward Richard, her earrings glinting. "She's got some nerve," she muttered, just loud enough for Olivia to hear. Edward raised his glass slightly, his smile thin. "Nerve doesn't buy you a seat here," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The cabin buzzed with agreement, their voices blending into a sharp hum. As Olivia settled into her seat, a woman in a sleek black dress, her nails tapping on a tablet, spoke up. Her name was Claire, a fashion editor who traveled the world judging people by their outfit. She tilted her head, her eyes raking over Olivia's sneakers with a look of pure disdain. "I hope they don't let just anyone in here now," she said, her voice loud enough to carry over the engine hum. "Is cabin supposed to have standards?" A few passengers chuckled their heads, turning to see Olivia's reaction. She didn't give them one. Instead, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open to a page filled with neat handwriting. Her fingers moved over the pages, steady and unhurried, like she was oblivious to the stares. Claire's lips pursed, her tablet screen forgotten. "Some people don't know their place," she added, her voice sharper now, like she was daring Olivia to respond. Karen handed the boarding pass back, her lips pursed like she tasted something sour. "We'll need to verify this," she said, her heels clicking as she turned away. The passengers kept going, their voices overlapping now, each one trying to outdo the other. "Who let her in here?" Richard said, his Rolex catching the light as he gestured. "This is why they need stricter checks for business class." Jessica nodded, her smile sharp. "It's embarrassing for everyone else. Like, I have some self-respect." A woman in a silk scarf, her perfume heavy enough to fill the cabin, added her own jab. "Maybe she's lost," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. Her name was Linda, a corporate lawyer who loathed the sound of her own voice. Olivia adjusted her backpack, her fingers brushing the zipper, and settled into her seat. Her silence made the room feel smaller, like the walls were closing in. A new voice joined the fray, a man in his 30s with slicked back hair and a custom suit that screamed money. His name was Mark, a venture capitalist who never missed a chance to show off his connections. He leaned forward, his phone in hand, already typing out a text. "I'm tweeting about this," he said, his voice loud and smug. "Business class isn't what it used to be when they let people like her in." He glanced at Olivia, expecting her to shrink under his gaze. She didn't. She shifted slightly in her seat, her sneakers brushing the floor, and opened her notebook again. Her pen moved across the page, slow and deliberate, like she was writing down every word they said. Mark's fingers hesitated on his phone, his smirk faltering for just a second. The other passengers egged him on, their laughter sharp and eager. But Olivia's calm seemed to unsettle them, like a shadow they couldn't shake. The mockery didn't let up. Richard leaned back, his blazer creasing, and raised his voice. "I'm not paying for a premium seat to sit next to someone who looks like they slept in a dumpster," he said, his eyes flicking to Olivia for a reaction. She didn't give him one. Her hands rested on her lap, her fingers loosely clasped, her sneakers tucked neatly under the seat. Jessica laughed, her earrings swaying. "Seriously, those jeans? Did she pull them out of a laundry basket?" Greg, the hedge fund guy, chuckled, his smirk widening. "I bet she's got a sob story ready to scam an upgrade." The cabin buzzed with their voices, each one sharper, meaner, like they were feeding off each other's cruelty. Olivia's eyes flicked to the window where the tarmac stretched out under the plane's wing. For a moment, her fingers paused on the edge of her hoodie, like she was steadying herself. Then Olivia spoke, her voice low, but cutting through the noise. "Seat 2A has a jam seatbelt. Did maintenance clear that this morning?" The words landed like a punch nobody saw coming. Karen, who'd been halfway down the aisle, stopped dead, her clipboard clutched to her chest. Her face went pale, her red lipstick suddenly too bright against her skin. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice sharp but unsteady. The passengers exchanged glances, their laughter fading into murmurs. Richard muttered, "She probably overheard someone in the terminal." Jessica nodded, but her smile was tighter now, like she wasn't so sure. Olivia just shrugged her eyes, back on the window, her fingers resting on her backpack. The cabin went quiet, but it wasn't a comfortable quiet. It was the kind that makes your skin itch. Just then, a ground crew member's voice crackled over a radio, clipped to Karen's belt, barely audible, but sharp. "Maintenance log for 2A was signed off by Carter's team this morning." The words hung in the air, unnoticed by most passengers, but not by Olivia. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, as she adjusted her backpack strap. Karen's hand froze on the radio, her eyes darting to Olivia, who didn't look up. The other passengers didn't catch the exchange, too busy whispering among themselves. Edward, the tech CEO, leaned toward Mark, his champagne glass now empty. "She's probably some low-level employee who got lucky with a seat," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Doesn't mean she belongs here." Olivia's pen paused on her notebook, her fingers tightening for a moment, before she continued writing, her face unreadable. A younger flight attendant Mike approached with a baggage scale, his nervous smile not quite hiding his unease. He was in his early 20s, his uniform a little too big, like he was still growing into the job. "Ma'am, we need to check your carry-on," he said, his voice softer than Karen's, but still firm. Olivia unzipped her backpack and handed it over without a word. Mike rummaged through it, pulling out a worn laptop with a cracked corner, a stack of dog-eared files, and a small metal card that caught the light. Richard leaned over, his eyebrows raised. "An outdated laptop like that?" he said, his voice loud enough to draw more eyes. "What is she, stuck in the 90s? Jessica snorted, her earrings glinting as she leaned forward. "That card's probably fake. Who even carries something like that?" Linda, the lawyer, added, "Looks like something you'd buy at a flea market." Olivia reached for her bag, her fingers brushing the metal card before she zipped it shut. "It's mine," she said, her voice quiet but final. Mike hesitated, then handed the bag back, his hands shaking slightly. As Mike walked away, a woman in her 50s dressed in a tailored blazer and carrying a designer handbag spoke up. Her name was Patricia, a retired executive who still acted like she ran the show. She adjusted her glasses, her voice dripping with authority. "This is why I avoid commercial flights," she said, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "They let anyone in these days." She glanced at Olivia, her eyes cold and judgmental, like she was sizing up a competitor. Olivia didn't look up, but her fingers paused on her notebook, her pen hovering over the page. The other passengers nodded, their murmurs growing louder like they were rallying behind Patricia's words. Olivia's shoulders stiffened just for a moment before she flipped to a new page and kept writing. Patricia's lips curled like she'd scored a point, but Olivia's calm seemed to unsettle her more than she let on. The co-pilot, Tom, passed through the cabin on his way to the cockpit. He was lanky with a crew cut and tired eyes like he'd been flying too many red-eyes. His gaze caught the metal card just as Olivia zipped her bag. His step faltered, his face going pale like he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his eyes darting to Olivia. She met his gaze for a split second before looking away, her fingers resting on the zipper. Tom swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and hurried toward the cockpit, his steps uneven. The passengers didn't notice, too busy with their own chatter. "She's totally faking it," Jessica said, her voice sharp again. "What kind of person carries junk like that and expects to sit here?" Richard laughed, but it sounded forced, like he was trying to keep the momentum going. Linda leaned back, her silk scarf slipping slightly. "She's probably some wannabe trying to scam her way in," she said, her voice smooth but cruel. A new passenger, a man in a cashmere sweater named Daniel, joined the conversation. He was a private equity investor, his voice smooth and polished like he was used to commanding attention. He leaned forward, his eyes flicking to Olivia's sneakers. "I've seen this before," he said, his tone casual but this cutting. "People like her think they can just walk in and blend with the rest of us." He chuckled, shaking his head like Olivia was a child who'd wandered into the wrong room. The other passengers laughed, their voices louder now, like they were emboldened by his confidence. Olivia's hand paused on her notebook, her fingers brushing the edge of a small keychain attached to her backpack. A faded metal charm shaped like a plane. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment, her lips tightening before she went back to writing. Daniel's chuckle faded, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. The tension in the cabin kept climbing, like the air was getting heavier. Richard stood up, his face red now, like he was personally offended by Olivia's presence. "I'm not sitting next to someone who looks like they snuck in," he said, his voice loud enough to echo. "This is ridiculous." Jessica nodded, her earrings swaying. "She's ruining the whole vibe of this cabin." "Get her out." Greg, the hedge fund guy, leaned forward, his smirk back in place. "I'm not here to fly with charity cases," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Other passengers murmured agreement, their voices blending into a low, ugly hum. Karen hesitated, her clipboard shaking in her hands. "Ma'am," she said, her voice tight, "I'm sorry, but you'll have to leave. We can't have disruptions." Olivia stood, her movements slow and deliberate, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The laughter came back louder now, like they had won something. As Olivia stepped toward the aisle, a woman in a green dress, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail, spoke up. Her name was Emily, a socialite who thrived on being the center of attention. She clutched a glass of wine, her voice loud and theatrical. "This is why I always fly private," she said, her eyes locked on Olivia. "You don't have to deal with this." She gestured at Olivia's hoodie, her smile sharp and cruel. The other passengers laughed, their voices rising like a wave. Olivia paused, her hand tightening on her backpack strap, her eyes flicking to Emily for just a moment. The socialite's smile faltered like she'd expected a bigger reaction. Olivia's gaze moved to the window where a ground crew worker was loading luggage, his jacket emblazoned with the airline's logo. Her fingers brushed the keychain on her bag, the tiny plane glinting faintly before she continued toward the aisle. Tom, the co-pilot, appeared again, his face still pale. He caught her arm just outside the cabin door, his voice barely a whisper. "Madam Carter," he said, his eyes wide with panic. "I'm so sorry for the mistake." Olivia's eyes were cold like polished steel, but she nodded once, sharp and precise. Tom hurried back to the cockpit, his steps uneven, his hands stuffed in his pockets. The passengers didn't hear the exchange, too busy celebrating. "Good riddance," Richard said, leaning back in his seat. Jessica clapped her hands, her laugh sharp and brittle. "Finally some standards," she said. Linda adjusted her scarf, her smile smug. "Maybe next time she'll dress the part," she said, her voice carrying over the hum of the engines. Olivia paused at the edge of the cabin, her hand resting on the curtain. She didn't turn back, but her silence felt louder than their words. As Olivia stepped back into the cabin, a man in a dark suit, his cufflinks glinting under the lights, stood up. His name was Thomas, a corporate consultant who prided himself on his connections. He crossed his arms, his voice booming. "This is a disgrace," he said, his eyes locked on Olivia. "People like her make a mockery of what business class stands for." The other passengers nodded, their murmurs growing louder like they were rallying behind his words. Olivia didn't respond. She sat back down in her movements slow and deliberate, like she was reclaiming the space. Her backpack rested at her feet, the tiny plain keychain catching the light. Thomas's face reddened like he was insulted by her call. "You're not fooling anyone?" he added, his voice sharp. The cabin buzzed with agreement, but Olivia's silence seemed to pull the air tighter. The mockery kept going even after she sat down. Richard was on a roll now, his voice booming. "Madam Carter, what a scam," he said, shaking his head. "If she's a billionaire, I'm the damn president." Jessica laughed, her earrings catching the light. "It's all in her head. Look at her. She's nobody." Greg joined in, his smirk wider now. "Probably some con artist with a fake boarding pass," he said. A new passenger, a woman in a red blazer named Susan, piped up. She was a marketing exec, her voice sharp and confident. "I've seen her type before," she said. "They think they can bluff their way into anything." The cabin buzzed with their voices, each one trying to top the last. Olivia's eyes flicked to her notebook, her pen moving slowly across the page, like she was documenting every word. Her calm seemed to unsettle them, like a mirror they didn't want to look into. Then the intercom crackled and the captain's voice cut through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, please be respectful. The owner of this airline, Madam Olivia Carter, is on board this flight." The words hit like a thunderclap. The cabin went silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Karen froze, her tray, slipping in her hands, a glass of water spilling onto the floor. Richard sank back into his seat, his face white as the napkin in his lap. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed, her earrings suddenly looking too heavy. Greg's smirk vanished, his hands gripping the armrests. Susan, the marketing exec, stared at her phone, her fingers frozen mid-scroll. Olivia didn't react. She sat back down in 2A, her movements smooth and unhurried. "Let's continue the journey," she said, her voice soft but sharp like a blade sliding into its sheath. A passenger in the back, a woman in a beige coat named Margaret, gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. She was a retired professor, her voice usually soft but now trembling with shock. "Oh my God," she whispered loud enough for the cabin to hear. That's her." Her eyes darted to Olivia, wide with disbelief, as if she was seeing her for the first time. The other passengers turned, their faces a mix of shame and fear. Margaret's hands shook as she fumbled with her purse, pulling out a tissue and pressing it to her lips. Olivia didn't look up, but her fingers paused on her notebook, her pen hovering for just a moment. The cabin's silence grew heavier, like the air was pressing down on them, forcing them to face what they'd done. The silence held for a long moment, broken only by the hum of the engines. Richard was the first to crack. He leaned forward, his hands shaking as he tried to find his voice. "Madam Carter, I didn't know," he stammered, his Rolex glinting as he gestured helplessly. "I'm so sorry." Jessica tried to laugh, but it came out as a nervous squeak. "I was just joking," she said, her voice high and thin. "Please forgive me." Linda adjusted her scarf, her hands trembling slightly. "We didn't mean anything by it," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. Susan looked away, her red blazer suddenly feeling too bright. Other passengers shifted in their seats, some bowing their heads, others wiping sweat from their brows. Olivia didn't look at them. She fastened her seatbelt, the click loud in the silent cabin, and opened her laptop. A man in a polo shirt, his face flushed from too much wine, tried to recover. His name was Paul, a car dealership owner who loved being the loudest in the room. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky but trying to sound confident. "Look, it was just a misunderstanding," he said, his hands spread wide like he was addressing a crowd. "We didn't know who you were, Madam Carter." He forced a smile, but it crumbled under Olivia's steady gaze. She didn't respond, just tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his for a moment before moving back to her laptop. Paul's face reddened, his hands dropping to his lap. The other passengers watched their own apologies dying in their throats as Olivia's silence filled the cabin with a weight they couldn't escape. The captain himself appeared a few minutes later, his uniform crisp, his face serious. He was older with gray at his temples and a calm authority that filled the room. He stood at the front of the cabin, his hands clasped behind his back. "Madam Carter," he said, his voice steady but respectful. "Everything is ready." Olivia looked up from her laptop, her eyes glinting with something cold and sharp. "Remember this," she said, her voice low, but carrying to every corner of the cabin. "I never forgive arrogance." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The captain nodded once, then turned back to the cockpit. The passengers sat frozen, their faces a mix of shame and fear. The engines roared as the plane began to taxi, and nobody dared to speak. As the plane climbed, a flight attendant in the back, a young woman named Sarah, hesitated near Olivia's seat. She was new, her badge still shiny, her hands nervous as she held a tray of drinks. "Ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Would you like anything?" Her eyes darted to Karen, who was watching from the galley, her face pale. Olivia looked up, her expression softening for just a moment. "Water," she said, her voice quiet but kind. Sarah nodded quickly, nearly spilling the glass as she handed it over. The other passengers watched, their eyes wide, like they were waiting for Olivia to lash out. She didn't. She took a sip, her movements calm, and set the glass down. Sarah backed away, her hands trembling like she'd just passed a test she didn't understand. The rest of the flight was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. Karen moved through the cabin like a ghost, her hands shaking every time she passed Olivia's seat. Richard kept his head down, his phone forgotten in his lap. Jessica stared out the window, her earrings still, but her hands twisting the edge of her scarf. Greg's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his smirk long gone. Susan kept her eyes on her phone, scrolling aimlessly, her face pale. Olivia worked on her laptop, her fingers moving steadily, her face calm. But every so often she'd pause, her eyes flicking to the side, like she was seeing something far away. Once, her gaze landed on a small photo tucked into the side of her backpack, a faded picture of a little girl in a school uniform standing next to a stern-looking woman in a suit. Olivia's fingers brushed the edge of the photo, then moved on. During the flight, a passenger in a corner seat, a man named Robert, tried to break the tension. He was a middle-aged lawyer, his tie loose, his voice overly cheerful. "Hey, Madam Carter," he called out, his tone forced like he was trying to lighten the mood. "You've got to admit this was a wild mix-up, right?" He laughed, but it was thin, like he knew it wouldn't land. Olivia didn't look up, but her fingers paused on her keyboard, her head tilting slightly. The other passengers froze, their eyes darting between Robert and Olivia. Her silence stretched heavy and deliberate until Robert's laugh died in his throat. He sank back into his seat, his face flushed, his hands fumbling with his tie. The cabin's silence grew thicker like a fog nobody could see through. The plane landed smoothly, but the tension didn't break. As the passengers gathered their things, their movements were slow, like they were afraid to draw attention. Karen approached Olivia as she stood to leave, her voice barely above a whisper. "Madam Carter, I'm so sorry," she said, her eyes on the floor. Olivia didn't respond. She slung her backpack over her shoulder and walked toward the exit, her steps steady. Richard tried to catch her eye, but she didn't look back. Jessica clutched her purse, her knuckles white. Linda adjusted her scarf one last time, her hands trembling. Susan stared at the floor, her red blazer crumpled now. The other passengers watched Olivia, go, their faces a mix of guilt and disbelief. This story isn't just about one flight. It's about every time someone's been looked down on, every time someone's been told they don't belong. It's for the people who've stood in rooms where nobody saw them, where nobody cared to look twice. Olivia's story is theirs too. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to beg. She just stood there, and the truth did the rest. You know what that feels like? You've been there. You've carried the weight of those looks, those words. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone. And you're still here standing. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.